Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Blarty said, I'm Bernard Russo, the Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement in the School of Health and Rehab Sciences, and also Professor and Chair in the Department of CSD here at Pitt. I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Equity, Justice, and Inclusion lecture series in CSD. Pitt CSD is proud to partner with Edinburgh University here in PA in hosting today's lecture. I'd like to also formally acknowledge Craig Coleman, the chair at Edinburgh CSD and one of our very own, proud alumnus of our master's program in speech language pathology here at Pitt. So this week we kick off the second semester of our year of engagement at Pitt. We also honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during Pitt's annual Social Justice Week, which runs through tomorrow. And so it's fitting and appropriate that today we amplify the work
outside a little bit
of Dr. Charles Ellis Jr., who is not only an inspirational scientist and researcher, but also a strong advocate and ally for individuals with aphasia, a debilitating communication disorder.
Of AJSLP, and that's pretty much ready to go. I thank you all. Thank you all.
And so today we stand with Dr. Ellis in supporting and advancing the field's efforts in health equity. We also pay tribute to Dr. King, who once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I had a great conversation with Dr. Ellis this morning, and I think what you may hear him say is that we may not, and he may not have all the answers to addressing healthcare disparities and getting us to health equity and aphasia care, but we have a lot of our current and future thought leaders here on this call. And PhD students, we're especially looking at you as you enter the workforce and begin crafting your own research programs and careers of service in the field. So our vision for this Equity, Justice, Inclusion Talk series is to amplify the work of people like Charles and others doing work to achieve health equity in the field of CSD as a means to communicating the current needs and getting our students excited about doing this work. Or as the hashtag that we're using to promote this event so nicely articulates, be the solution. As in a personal aside, Charles and I realized this morning that we both received Fellowship of the Association in 2014 from Aphasia. We did chat briefly during the award ceremony. It was an honor sharing the stage with Dr. Ellis. And those of you that know me know that Dr. Kenyatta Rivers and Dr. Linda Rose Lugo, two of my earliest mentors in the field from the University of Central Florida, also received fellowship that year. So it was an honor sharing the stage with Dr. Ellis, Dr. Rivers, and Dr. Rose Lugo, who have all been, in many ways, strong advocates and allies for individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, and really have moved us and are continuing to move us towards health equity for our patients. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mike Dickey, our PhD program director, who will be introducing our inaugural speaker today, Dr. Charles Ellis Jr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Russo. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce today's Equity, Justice, and Inclusion speaker, Dr. Charles Ellis. Dr. Ellis received his undergraduate and clinical degrees in speech language pathology from the University of Georgia and his PhD in rehabilitation sciences from the University of Florida. He currently serves as professor and director of doctoral education in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at East Carolina University, where he directs the Communication Equity and Outcomes Laboratory, carrying out research well aligned with the vision that Dr. Russo described in his introduction to our EGI speaker series. Dr. Ellis's research is designed to understand outcomes associated with adults' neurologically based disorders of communication, as well as factors that contribute to the lack of equity in service provision and outcome disparities that exist among some groups of individuals. In the domain of aphasiology, he's well known for carrying out landmark and widely cited work examining prognostic factors in post-stroke aphasia, as well as quantifying the costs of living with aphasia, critical questions in aphasia recovery and communicative healthcare and outcomes. These are among some of his best known work, but he's been a bulwark contributor to the area of clinical aphasiology and a member of the clinical aphasiology community. Today, he's going to be sharing some of his work related to racial disparities and racial equity in aphasia. Please join me in welcoming today's Research Roundtable and EJI speaker, Dr. Charles Ellis.
All right, so thank you all for having me today. Dr. Rousseau, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to just give you a little of my background because I think it drives a lot of what I think about and how I think about these issues in our field. I agree with Dr. Rousseau. What I'm going to present today, I think will leave us with more questions than answers. And I do think there are some foundation information that can be utilized to think about other communication disorders, even in pediatrics. I think I have a very narrow lens that I look through in terms of adult aphasia, but some of the concepts that I want to introduce today, I think could have broader appeal. So I grew up in a small little town in Georgia, Claxton, Georgia. It's the fruitcake capital of the world. If you've gone in any grocery store in America, definitely Europe, I've seen those little cakes there. Well, they make those about about a mile from where I grew up, and that's what my little town is known for. But it's actually known for something else that gets less attention, but it's very important for the study of disparities. Is in this little town in the county was the Evans County Heart Study, and it was the seminal study of heart disease in America. And interestingly, there was a local doctor, and he was my doctor when I was a little kid, who noticed that in the community, the rate of cardiovascular disease was far greater among whites than blacks. And so he was interested of why this disparity existed. That study went on for many, many years. No clear answer was ever developed. And over time, that disparity has shifted, that you would not think in 2021 that there would be any cardiovascular disease-related issue that the rates would be higher in whites than blacks. But they demonstrated it very consistently, and there were many, many theories that it was the soil in Southeast Georgia, it's sunlight, that people of color engaged in more farm work, more physical work. And even though many of the Black residents were smokers, the disease rates were still lower. And even when they tried to compare an economic strata, they still had lower cardiovascular disease rates. And I think there are several hundred papers published from that study. And although the disparity has shifted over time, it was landmark work to help us understand these differences in disparities and health equity. So I want to talk briefly today about some of these issues and what they might mean for our field. I want to try to probably focus a little more on the equity part, because I think what we know about disparities is fairly clear, but how we get there in neurogenic communication disorders is probably not as clear. And so I want us to maybe think about it from the lens of the broader condition, stroke and cardiovascular disease, and then drill that down to aphasia. So I'd like to explore some of the issues related to social determinants of health and talk about these upstream and these downstream factors that may be affecting some of the outcomes that we see in aphasia. I want to talk briefly about and really hear your thoughts about evidence-based practice, because I do think a lot of clinicians can interpret that as that we have a body of evidence and we apply it equally to different patients, and that will not help us get equity. So I want to just kind of raise that issue and get us to think about it, and then talk about some strategies in the area of research, because I think we're just in the beginning of trying to understand some of these issues. So I want to just start with some basic definitions. Health disparities are differences in health outcomes and the causes that may exist between different groups. The beginning or my early work is focused primarily on race, but in the area of aphasia, evidence has emerged that it's not simply race, that it's socioeconomic status, it's this age disparity that we see very commonly between non-Hispanic Blacks and whites of lifespan and stroke onset. Also, residence plays a huge role, that many states that have these major cities are still predominantly rural states. And so there's a huge disparity between residents who live in urban areas versus those who live in rural areas. So for example, the state of North Carolina, there are 100 counties, and 88 of those counties are considered rural by definitions of the federal government. So although you have cities like Raleigh and Greensboro and Charlotte that have fairly big population, that doesn't represent most of North Carolina. So it's not simply race, although a lot of my work is focused there. I'm going to try to help us think in a broader context so that we can really try to unravel some of these issues of health disparities. Then there are also health care disparities. Dr. Rousseau and I had a great conversation this morning about this issue, in that it's not simply presence or absence of insurance, and we tend to go to that variable too often, but there is very good evidence in the adult literature and the pediatric literature of general health literature that when you get to, say, middle class individuals who have insurance, there's still a disparity in how they choose to access services, and then the services that are actually provided. So this idea of just giving everyone insurance doesn't necessarily fix this broader problem. And then our last key term here is health equity, is when everyone has the same opportunity for optimal health. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there is equality in what they receive. It is important to note that health disparities they're not new. A lot of what we're seeing in society today is put a magnifying glass on disparities, particularly as we see them in COVID. However, anyone who's been following the disparities literature would not have been surprised of the disparities that we see by race in COVID, because they're exactly in line with what we've seen for decades in stroke, cardiovascular disease, cancers, that rates among people of color are 2 to 3 times greater. So COVID is not really a surprise. It's simply that it's magnified by the amount of death that's occurring in the U.S. And so there are many who have concerns that, like many issues related to disparities and equity, that this will eventually move to the back pages. So it's important for us to really think about it from a historical standpoint. If we go back to the Clinton administration, President Clinton convened a group of individuals to produce this report through the Institute of Medicine called Unequal Treatment. This was published in 2003. The actual research occurred somewhere 2001, 2002, and they found that across a wide range of disease conditions that there were disparities in the outcomes. And they also found that there were disparities in the likelihood of different racial ethnic groups receiving different types of services, and that these disparities also existed across a wide range of healthcare systems. And that ultimately these disparities resulted in higher mortality rates among people of color. There's a nice little figure that was produced there that I think it explains some of these concepts a bit better, in that you can have these differences in outcomes. And there's a lot of different reasons why you might have differences in outcomes, but the disparity is generally believed to occur when there are system-wide problems or there are provider-related problems that are in line with discrimination, biases, stereotyping, and then just general uncertainty about how different types of treatments impact different population groups. So, for example, there are a wide range of hypertension medications. That would be a good example. But along the same line, there's good evidence that some of those medications do not work very well in people of color. So a physician who's prescribing these different medications would have to understand the reasons why they don't work and then prescribe medications accordingly. So this idea of just having a general bias or just being uncertain about what this means has ultimately a big impact on the outcomes that we see. That gets us kind of back to where we started, that there is no simple solution for the issues that we're going to discuss today. It's not just if we do A and B, then C will pop out better on the other end. It just doesn't really work that way. Then moving forward, under the Obama administration, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, if you go back and look at the history of how we got to the final act, we focused so much on the insurance of everyone having insurance, but it was originally designed to try to reduce the health care disparities that existed, and to help improve access to care. So it was to improve access to care, reduce disparities, and drive down costs. But ultimately, it became about cost and everyone having, do we believe everyone should have, deserves to have, needs to have insurance, when ultimately that's not even really where the bill started. For us, there was a nice benefit, and that was PCORI. So I'm guessing that some of you on this call probably have received funding through PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and that was developed and funded under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So there was a lot of components that were well beyond just should everyone have insurance. Now, this is the issue that I want us to think about as we're going forward, this idea of equality or equity. So equality just means everyone gets the same. In health and disease, everyone getting the same can't get to optimal outcomes for all, because many groups, many individuals, they need something different. They need equity. They need the type of service or care that optimizes their outcomes. And if we think about this through our traditional evidence-based practice approach, our triangle here, I think we have a long way to go in really providing evidence-based care the way that it's operationally defined, because I think we do a great job with our clinical expertise. We have excellent scientific knowledge, but we generally don't train the next clinicians on understanding the diversity of patients and values and preferences. So oftentimes when we say that a person is non-compliant or they're not motivated, they may simply just not like the clinician that's in front of them. And that is very different than saying someone who is depressed who may have the same reaction. So it's a very complex side. I don't know that you can really understand every value and preference for the thousands of patients that we see, but I do think we could make some movement and understanding that every patient is not the same. They don't all come to the table loving us as SLPs. They don't all love what we're doing. Many of them can't really appreciate the service that we're providing. And then there are probably others who really would rather just be home recovering from the broader cause of the communication disorders that we're treating, as opposed to the types of activities that we complete. So it's very, I think it's super complicated, and I think it's a place that we have to spend a lot more time. So even as a new graduate, one of the first things I noticed is that in most of the research in our field, in the early 2000s when I started, there was rarely ever reporting of race. And that seemed very odd to me because there is such a difference and disparity in the underlying chronic conditions that cause aphasia. So how are we completing studies of aphasia and we don't consider the race of the participants? So if we go back upstream, we know that African Americans tend to be 7 to 10 years younger at stroke onset. They have more severe strokes, they have greater disability, they're more likely to die. So I would think that some of that translates down into aphasia outcomes. But in the absence of any real data, it's simply speculation on my part. So I wrote this piece in 2009, and the conclusion was that few studies ever report race or ethnicity. So we don't really even know what these outcomes mean. So if you have a population group that some are African Americans, some are non-Hispanic white, some are whatever, then the outcome that you're measuring, the group outcome, may be a reflection of a lot of the heterogeneity within the group and within these different racial ethnic groups. So here's a statement that I made at the end of the paper. Therefore, one might conclude that race ethnicity really does matter in the study of adult neurogenics. And I think that would apply to many of the communication disorders that we face. So in 2009, there were very few studies, and I was simply raising this question. But then as I started to comb the literature, there was some evidence that Wirtz published a study in '97 using the PICA, and he found that that there were gestural and graphic modality differences when you compared blacks and whites, and you consider things like stroke severity, age, that there were some differences. In 2002, a very similar study with the Minnesota and components of the WAB, that they found issues that were different in verbal fluency. So Richard Peach and Richard was my undergrad advisor, who's been with me. I guess I've been with him throughout this entire career. That I said, hey, listen, I want to start measuring this. And he told me there's an aphasia bank. Maybe that's a place to start. So we looked at two things, the Boston naming test, and then we examined WAB differences. There were very few, I think only about 10% of the total sample at the time, 10 or 15% were non-Hispanic blacks, but we were able to make some comparisons, and lo and behold, Boston naming scores were were lower among blacks than whites. And when you broke down the aphasia quotient and really examined the subtest, and there were differences in verbal fluency and comprehension, even after controlling for age differences, educational levels, and overall severity scores. So now we're starting to get some clear answers, but the limitations of that work is that many of the data points did not have clear imaging data, because that's really where the answer likely lies, in the connection between the racial differences in the impairment level scores and how they link to what we know about cognitive and language issues after neurological conditions. That becomes very important because the disease profiles between Blacks and whites are very different, with one group more likely to have large vessel disease, the other group more small vessel disease, and then Blacks more likely to have hemorrhagic stroke than ischemic. So it's a complexity of factors that have to be considered in the upstream, and for us to have a far more organized body of research to draw conclusions as to what might be driving these differences. So then our next step, we have a paper under review of where we examine the same issue in the Moss Aphasia psycholinguistic database, which had a more of a 50-50 split of Black persons with aphasia and white persons with aphasia. Interestingly, in that data set, the age of the non-Hispanic Blacks was about 9 years younger. So initially, it looked that the white persons with aphasia had greater impairment, but after the adjustments for that age difference, Blacks had worse outcomes. So we're still working with that. Again, it's going to have the same limitations of the aphasia bank, because to truly answer this question, we have to get the imaging data and look beyond just these impairment level scores. So I guess around 2016 or 17, after Richard Peach and I started to see these differences, I knew the next place was to think about equity of service provision. And in order to do that, we needed to take a different approach in our field. And so I knew a couple of economists who could look at national data to look at service utilization. And as you would imagine, if I have found greater impairment in African Americans or non-Hispanic Blacks in clinical outcomes, I would assume that it is somehow tied to less or worse service utilization. And it turns out that wasn't the answer at all. That when we looked at just general healthcare utilization, so two patients, an African American and a white patient, come in, what services do they receive and how much does that cost? Overall, the Black patients had longer length of stays, they cost more, and they had greater service utilization, which doesn't equate to our earlier findings of greater impairment. Our next step, we took the same hospital level data to just look at SLP utilization, to look at the CPT codes, and then to calculate the cost of aphasia. Again, in the state of North Carolina, over a 2-year period, Blacks with aphasia received more services and at a greater cost. But I want to remind you, this is in the acute care setting only. So in order to truly examine this issue of equity, you have to follow them all the way through, because there's good evidence in the greater chronic disease literature that these differences that exist in the acute care, ultimately they change when they go to outpatient, and patients go in different directions in these across these levels of care based on insurance and a lot of other factors. So again, we're left with more questions than answers. So we have a clinical outcome that's worse in one group, but in the early stages of managing the condition, they're receiving more services and at a greater cost. So we're now looking at Medicare data so that we can follow them all the way through to see what's happening on the outpatient end. Now, because we know that race does not operate in isolation, the next question we started to think about is, does it matter where you live? And here's why it might matter. Individuals who live in rural areas, they tend to be self-employed. They tend to have jobs that have no or lesser degree of health insurance. And because of lack of providers, they tend to have limited access to regular health care. Life expectancy in rural communities is lower. Healthcare delivery can be influenced by how close they are to more urban uh, areas, and there are also unique characteristics of these communities as well. So we took the same North Carolina data to examine both race and residence. And as it turned out, that race still was the stronger predictor, that in general, greater services in this acute care settings were received by non-Hispanic Blacks, whether they lived in urban uh, or rural areas. But ultimately, the rural non-Hispanic Blacks had longer length of stays and received greater SLP services. And the economists would say, yeah, they're keeping them longer in the acute care because once they leave, there's really nowhere for them to go and receive services. So that would be kind of their preliminary thought of what's happening. So again, this issue of outcomes that we measure in conditions like aphasia become very complicated. So then our next question, well, what else matters? And as it turns out, if you're looking beyond just our aphasia that we care about or that I care about, and whatever specific condition that you probably think the most about, we have to ask the question, well, what else is contributing to what we're seeing when we're knee to knee with these patients? And I found this quote that says, the good physician treats the disease, the great physician treats the patient who has the disease. And so I adapted it very quickly to say, the good SLP treats aphasia and the great SLP treats the person with aphasia. And I think a lot of where we're headed in terms of patient-centered care, it forces us to think about the diversity of patients, the differences, and how we should approach them. So again, bringing us back to this evidence-based triangle, my question would be, does our typical approach offer equity of services that might contribute to these disparities in outcomes? So if we view equity as a quality, making sure that everyone gets the same thing, does that really help? And do we really see those as separate? I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that a lot of clinicians that I come in contact with, they view this as getting the right evidence, the best evidence, and our experience, and kind of thinking about preferences, but then making sure everybody gets the same with some adjustments for severity of communication disorder. Well, if that's true, then that's not really equity. That's equality, and equality or lack of equity may not be driving the outcomes to optimal outcomes in the way that we want. So I'm going to propose, this is not trademarked or defined anywhere, that I would like to see us move beyond cultural competence, which is what I hear so much in our profession, to disparities and equity competence. And what I mean by that is that here's a nice definition for cultural competence. But the research literature shows very consistently that there is no evidence that cultural competence improves outcomes. Now, do I think that it improves outcomes? I do, but we haven't measured it. What we've measured is presence or absence of receiving competence training, and that we haven't moved beyond that to measure the impact of cultural competence on the ultimate outcome. How much does it really change the provider's decision making? And most folks argue that the evidence is just not there to support it. I think it's important. I don't want anyone to take away that Charles Ellis is saying cultural competence doesn't matter, but I do think we've got to take another step to see, is it changing Charles Ellis's behavior? Like you've educated him, but does it change his behavior? And here's some of the areas where I think it has to change behavior. Understanding of the role that social determinants of health play, understanding upstream and downstream. I'm going to talk about those and how that affects recovery. It's more than just the service that we're providing, but it's really what the life course to get to the stroke that caused the aphasia. Understanding families, networks. Your network may not be the same as your client's network. I have no family in North Carolina. I have an excellent network in North Carolina, and I'm not related to anyone. Just as strong a network as I would in Georgia with my biological family. I think sometimes we see our patients' networks and what's available to them through our own network. So we'll talk about why that's important. And then again, a bit more about this issue of evidence-based practice. So social determinants are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And it's not simply where the person is right now, but it's the life course that drives some of the health that we see that cause the conditions that we manage. Okay, so thinking beyond that, it's not only their systems, but it's also the how they engage or have access to different health systems that can also drive these differences. So here's an example. This is a study, not a study, but a more of an opinion to help us think about why there might be racial differences in post-stroke disability. And generally what the evidence is starting to show is that regardless of your race, there's this decline that happens. And then also regardless of race, there starts to be this recovery trajectory in the early period that seems to be very similar across racial ethnic groups. But as soon as these clients go home, then that's where you start to see a major difference in that many non-Hispanic whites will have a bit of a decline, but they're still showing some improvement. But people of color have a far more rapid decline. Is it their living environment? Is it their support networks? It's all of them. It's what's happening after they leave health systems, and it's also what happened to get them there. And this is what I mean, that when two patients come in with a condition like stroke, they're not the same, even if they're the same age. That we know in the literature, and I'll show you some examples, that there are differences in disease comorbidity that aligns by race. There's differences in disease duration of these comorbid conditions, and there's also differences in severity. So when two patients come in, and I don't know if you can see that arrow, they come with very different disease characteristics that cause the stroke, and it's not clear if it affects the types of aphasia that we see. And unfortunately, we're working out here at the level of impairment. We give very little attention to this life course and also well-established differences in processes of care and service utilization and costs that exist. So it's not simply what's happening with the aphasia outcomes, but it's how the patient got to this place of having a stroke, and then what happens from the stroke until we're sitting knee to knee with them to address the aphasia or communication disorder that you're working with. Here's some evidence. I don't want you, because these slides always look, the tables always look better until you get them on a PowerPoint in the middle of your presentation. But essentially what this is saying is that when you compare African-American children and non-African-American, non-Hispanic white, anyone that's not African-American, that the onset of hypertension starts much earlier. And so if we just think about vascular disease in general, the damage has started in their vascular system at a much younger age than whites. Similarly, diabetes onset starts at a younger age in African Americans than whites. Type 1 or type 2, the differences are already there. So when they arrive at having a stroke at 60 or 70, the disease duration across different racial ethnic groups are not the same, and they don't arrive at the same point. And then there's a bit more evidence in terms of vascular stiffness. We know that this contributes to worse outcomes. Vascular stiffness starts in adolescence in African Americans, and it does not in whites. It doesn't, and we don't really know the specifics. And this next table is kind of showing the same thing. So this life course is very different. So there is a 12-year-old African American and his best friend who's white that are on a playground somewhere, and one has a greater disease process that's already occurring, even though their makeup is exactly the same. So there's a lot of different things that are happening that I'm not sure that we can spend hours thinking about all of these issues and every client that we see, but our research has to move in a direction to account for some of these factors. Similarly, networks, I gave you an example of why networks are important. We typically measure social support. We know that if a person has a spouse, they do better. Well, people who are moving beyond just measuring one person, they know that the stronger the network, the better the health and the better the recovery. So it boils down to this slide that I kind of created, that when we're here dealing with aphasia, there are current social determinants of health that are occurring. So I, as a 50-something-year-old African-American man, have the world that I live in is a certain way. But you have to go back for each of us and look at this life course. So my life course doesn't necessarily align with where I am now. So a lot of what drives my health and disease started a long time ago. And although I'm in a place now that I understand a lot more about health, I have insurance working at a university, I can go to the doctor whenever I want. A lot of the damage was already done well before I went off to college to get to this point. So it's a lot to think about. And then I would say the last thing that it's hard for us to consider because we don't want to blame the patients, but patients do have beliefs and attitudes about healthcare. And some of them would rather watch TV all day than come to speech therapy. They just would. And I remember one of the first clients that I saw, they were talking to him about reducing his pork intake. And apparently he cured pork and he told us, I'd rather die than not eat pork. That was kind of a shocker to me, because at that point I was giving up pork and beef and I was giving up everything. And he said, no, he'd rather die. And I learned that there were a lot of folks that thought like that. So it's hard for us to account for beliefs and attitudes and how that's driving the outcomes that we're trying to measure. And then I want to add to, the health system doesn't necessarily help, because there's a lot of conflict in the goals, the things that we would like to do. Health systems, they are businesses, they're service organizations, but they at least have to balance their bottom line. And some of the approaches that we know work, like high intensity treatments, they don't align with how the American health system is organized or the reimbursement structure. So it's patients, clinicians, and policy that all contribute to these outcomes. And then just wanted to double back to the evidence-based issue. I don't want us leaving thinking Charles doesn't think much about evidence-based practice, because I do. I think it's super, super important. And I used to hear a lot of clinicians say, this is a long time ago when I started, if I just do something, then that will help. And once I got to some scientists like Jay Rosenbeck, who really understood neuroplasticity and all these issues, I found out that that was dead wrong, that sometimes just doing something makes it worse. So it's not simply that. But I do think we have to place more emphasis on patients' values and preferences and really understanding these upstream disease effects. So if you're going to measure outcome, and I'm speaking to myself, if I'm going to measure disparities, then my research has to move from database that I have to work with economists and neurologists and speech pathologists and psychologists to understand all of these upstream effects and how they contribute to this WAB aphasia quotient score that I'm receiving. I'm going to conclude here. This is a nice little, I found this paper just 2 nights ago, and I thought, oh, this is a nice little figure, because it kind of explains what we're up against. And it says that the green arrow represents the evolution of societal thought. And we're right in the midst of a major uptick in really thinking about health system. It advances the clock towards the future mores, norms evolve, and it goes in a clockwise rotation. But then there's the red arrow, which is the resistance to change. This is the force opposing modification created by inertia of accepted or typical convention of social order. And some of this has to do with government policy as well, and how it impacts likelihood of receiving services. And then there are these other personal characteristics, there are system-wide issues, there's institutional factors, systemic, and these are all in play. And so we make a little move one direction, and then a policy change can push us back. And so we're always on this wheel of trying to move forward in dealing with something that's far more complicated than we acknowledge when we're trying to study it. So my final thoughts, that in speech language, I talked about the lens of aphasia. I do think you can probably put in your disease that you're most focused on, that it's multidimensional, that it's very much like the chronic diseases that cause them. There are factors related to patients, providers, systems that all contribute to the outcomes that we achieve. We do need this disparities and equities competence, that we've got to understand life course, social determinants, lack of equity of care over time, and how that translates to the disorder that we're talking about. And whereas I can give you these nice figures of what I think it looks like, we need systematic and programmatic research that ties each of those areas for us to really advance. So again, I always leave with more questions than answers, but that's kind of where we are now. I'm hoping that your comments will help move this needle a bit. I want to thank some of the folks who have been very instrumental. That these are folks I go to when I have a thought, and sometimes I say, yeah, that thought is crazy and here's why, or that's an interesting thought and maybe we can measure it in this direction. So Richard Peach at Rush, Rich Lindrith, Rick and Rich. He's an economist. He's a guy I think who's done a lot for our discipline that we would have never have known, because he is a person who's testified before Congress quite a bit. And the work that we have done together has helped influence some of his thinking. He had a great doc student who's now has her PhD. And I have a guy here Patrick Briley, who's mostly into stuttering, but he's seeing kind of the same pattern. So we spend a lot of our time talking about these issues and trying to figure out what we can do in our respective areas. So thank you again for this opportunity. and I'll take any questions or thoughts that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, for posing critical questions that should occupy us as both clinicians and researchers, and sketching some directions that we might point in asking them. So I will please feel free to the audience. I say to the audience, we've got about 10 minutes for open questions right now. Please feel free to enter them into the chat. I can see that a number of questions are already lighting up the chat board. As is our custom in Research Roundtable, the honor of the first question will go to a student if a student has a question. Otherwise, we have some questions coming in on the chat. So I'll open it up to a student question first.
Now, it's the first question in the chat. Oh, that's Will. Gotcha.
Yeah, that's Will. So we'll
Okay.
we'll hold off on that for just a sec.
Yep.
We have a question also from Dr. Russo. So, all right, Azure.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Ellis. I really appreciated especially the part where you spoke about the difference between cultural competence and disparities equity competence. I remember the class that I took for my master's degree in multicultural counseling. I forget the exact title, but most of it was just about just not being a terrible person, treating other people nicely. And I kind of felt like, I mean, this is nice, but I feel like I know all of this. And I think that I never had really thought about the differences in health equity throughout my entire master's program. And I was wondering how, or what you think it might look like to incorporate some of these ideas into a master's level curriculum.
Yeah, we've been having that same discussion here. I think the first thing, and this is a faculty issue, there has to be some hard discussions about what does diversity and disparity and equity mean. And you find that it means a lot of different things. And because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, the way they communicate it, the way they think about it in their own work, the way they communicate it to students, leaves a lot of students very confused about what it means. So I think the first step is there has to be some general agreement on operational definitions, and then once you're in agreement on those areas, I do think the issues start to align across different specialty areas. So my buddy Patrick Brawley that I mentioned, he's in stuttering. I know absolutely nothing about stuttering. I'm learning about stuttering, but the issues of access to services, our telepractice work, the disparities by race and age and socioeconomic, they line up almost perfectly, whether you're talking about little kids with stuttering issues or adults with aphasia. So we're pretty much aligned because we're after the same thing, which is optimal outcomes, and that comes through equity. So I think once you operationalize everything, then it's easier to address that issue through individual classes and experiences. So even though I'm not a child language expert, actually I know little about child language since I've always thought about adults, but when students ask questions or they explain to me what they're discussing in other classes, the equity of service utilization or lack of utilization, those issues always return as driving the outcomes. So I just like to see us make some movement from cultural competence to the broader issue. We do need to be culturally competent. And that in itself is overwhelming for a lot of people. So that makes it hard for them.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Great question. We have some questions coming in on the chat actually related to that, but we're going to go first to a question from Dr. Russo, our chair and associate dean for equity and community outreach, and then to Dr. Evans from there.
A beautiful talk, Charles. So one question I had is, how much does healthcare policy play a role in addressing some of these challenges that you talked about with healthcare provision? And I mean, I think we know the answer because you pointed out that in your talk, one of the outcomes of the ACA was in fact increased coverage, which one might equate to being associated with increased access to healthcare. Yet, I think it was the Aphasiology paper that you showed showing that increased utilization of services for post-stroke patients and longer length of stays didn't necessarily result in increased or better outcomes. So maybe the question is, how do we need to think about, or what do we have to do differently in our policy making process to change some of these and to move the needle? And you mentioned PCORI obviously being one, which I see as one way where we started thinking about, well, we need to get the patients, we need to get stakeholders involved in this process. So maybe that's sort of a path forward. But it just seems like until we can solve the policy making process and how decisions are made about where resources are allocated, how services are provided, and getting this, just increasing utilization, just getting people more aware about these problems isn't going to solve the challenges that we face. So just kind of more broadly, your thoughts on how policy plays a role and can play a role in helping us solve these challenges.
There's a book that was published last year called The Political Determinants of Health by Daniel Dawes, I think it is. He's a physician at Morehouse Medical. And it's a historical account beginning pre-Civil War to explain issues of disparities and how policy either advances or forces them to regress. And he shows it from the earliest discussion that there's some discussion in some of Lincoln's talks about the health of Black people in America, and that after ending slavery, that they just had this worse health. And so there was movement to try to advance or to address the health issues. What happens historically when there is a marginalized group, somehow they get part of what we're talking about or part of what they need, and then the other part shifts to another group. And so at that point, it shifted to white Union soldiers, I believe, and a creation of a national health organization. And so in this book, he goes through the history of health disparities, and it ends with the Affordable Care Act. And he goes through kind of the 2 to 4 year process to how we got to what we consider Obamacare. But if you go back to where it started, that was not the goal that everyone would get health insurance. It was primarily greater access. It was reduced cost. That was a big part of it. But when there's reduced cost, there's players that are going to make less money. So they did not want that. And fundamentally, there were many people who did not want everyone to have health insurance because that creates an access problem for you if you do have health insurance. If everybody has insurance and they can go whenever they want, that's not good for you or not good for me if I just want to get an appointment tomorrow. I want to pull some strings and get one. So I would encourage everybody to look at that. It's about $10 on Amazon. I got the paper at Bad Eyes. Probably if you're younger, I bet there's a Kindle version for $2 or $3. And I would read it and to just see. I was shocked with how little I knew about policy and the number of attempts that there have been to create greater equity in this country, and that how the political forces, they just it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So some would feel that we just finished our 3 steps back, and then now we're going to have 2 steps forward. But what is lost in all of that is equity is lost and people lose their lives. So it's always this back and forth. So I don't think that part is going to change. In democracy, we when you have a say, when you're the government, when you have a say in government, you elect officials and they develop policy, that's what you end up with. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's a very compelling, very easy read, a book I would encourage everyone to read if they have any interest in these topics.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. We've got time for one more question here in our open forum. After that, I think I'll bring it to a close. Dr. Ellis, if you have time to stick around afterwards to answer additional questions, that'd be great. This comes from Will Evans. It came in on the chat. He says, thank you for the
If you want, Dr. Dick, I can probably sum it up faster.
Awesome.
Because then you don't have to read my typos. Right. So thank you so much. I just have a specific question about, you mentioned how these various social, cultural, and factors and healthcare beliefs affect utilization, affect participation. And there's been this issue I've been wondering about for a long time about the representation of our aphasia communities, where we do all our convenience sampling, right? And this other thing about where is everybody? If we think that there's probably at least 2 million stroke survivors with aphasia in the country, and I've done the numbers for Allegheny County, and there's probably at least 3,000 stroke survivors with aphasia here. The people are kind of looped into long-term support communities who are really active, who are advocating. Like, it's a drop in the bucket. And so I really wonder what everybody else looks like, what their needs are. Do they actually try things and drop out of the system because it's not needed? Like, what can we do if we're trying to do translational aphasia research for everybody with this principle of equity in mind? How do we start to tackle this issue of representation and convenience sampling? Tell me what to do.
Yeah, I learned a huge lesson through a telepractice grant. It was a community-based grant. I wanted to do it in the home. AHRQ said, no, we want a traditional telepractice where a client goes to a place in the community, you send someone there, and then you do the therapy from your lab. So I wanted the money because I wanted to study it. So I went with that. What we learned through that is that these people are everywhere, and that what we have to do is move out of those traditional communities. What we found is that in North Carolina, and I think a lot of states are organized, that every county has a center of aging. And in some of these counties, they have these very nice buildings with 3 or 4 rooms, and people from older adults from the community come to these centers. And once you go there, there's always someone there with aphasia who is not in your traditional community. So once we tapped into that and found that network, that's when we really found these people that you're talking about that are not a part of these communities. Second part of your question, what we learned is there's a lot of reasons why some persons with aphasia drop out of those communities. A big part is age. We found 5 people within 3 miles of our building under the age of 40 with aphasia. And one kid, young man, I can look out my office and see his grandmother's house where he spends all day, every day. Now, who would have known that he existed? And the way that we found him is just being in these community centers, and a person tells you about a person who tells you about a person who tells you about another person of this person that they know. We don't know if they have aphasia, whatever you call that, but we know that he can't talk well, that he had a stroke. And so we found them in these places everywhere. And then we found that once you break out of the traditional support groups, then the word really does get out, and then they find you. So my grant ended, I think, a year ago. We still have folks to call us wanting to participate. We still have some folks who they will not stop, no matter how we present it to them. And they're still making progress, and we can still use it as part of our student training. So we don't want them to drop out. So I think it's just thinking outside of those traditional groups. Sorry, Mike, that was a long answer.
No,
yeah.
a good answer to an important question and a great note to end on, encouraging us all to think more broadly, to try to think outside the box as we solve these really big problems. With that, I'll bring our formal session to a close. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for your talk and for being our inaugural speaker in our Equity, Justice, and Inclusion series, for sharing all of this. Thank you also for your willingness to stick around. If there are other folks who'd like to chat, I'll be happy to stay here. Applause are appropriate, including the awkward Zoom-based variety. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Hey, Charles, it's Davida.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Not bad.
Good.
Not
It's so
bad
nice,
at all.
so nice to see people and have a connection. And
No.
yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. So I did have two questions, not critical questions, but just your talk, made my head go spinning into various places. And maybe they're related, but one, when you were talking about measuring the impact of cultural competence on behavior, I just wondered what you would recommend as the way you'd want to measure that. Again, my head started spinning and I just thought, well, I'm sure yours has spun a lot more. And so I was curious what you thought about that. And then the other thing that might or might not be related is, it made me start thinking about the life participation approach to aphasia. And how that incorporates principles or aspects of cultural competence. And again, this is, on one end that's far away from, the policy and the guy across the street and, all of that. So maybe you don't think it's even that important to consider these questions. But if you had thoughts about these, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, for the live participant approach, I'll start there because I'm speaking, I think maybe in April, the Aphasia Access. So I'm going to learn a lot about what they, because that's a group that I haven't been as tied into. So I'll be very honest about that. So I'll find out a lot. But I think, though, the approach of really getting to these folks and getting them to a different outcome that's not